I'm very struck by the ambition in what you're saying, and I can't help thinking that, you know, if we had more people in your sorts of positions who've come from the experience, you know, not just of the private sector, but of running a company in this area, that must make a difference to how you approach setting the policy in this area.
Yeah, what I'm saying, I'm a startup as a minister, because this sort of ministry has not existed before, but we are a startup as a government. So around 50% of us are experts. Our finance minister, for example, our CFO is a former head of an insurance company, a big Austrian insurance company. And this is, I think, where the fit is right. And while I find myself happy about what I'm doing, I can do this now for many companies, which I've done before for one company.
Yeah, and you have the benefit of the insight from your previous role. So let me introduce everyone else who is with us. Justin McMullen is the Advocacy Director from Consumers International. Valerie Mocha is European Policy Director at Nesta, which is a foundation dedicated to innovation and backing new ideas to tackle the challenges of our time. Dr. Nuria Oliver is Director of Research in Data Science at Vodafone, and Thibaut Simphal is from Uber. Welcome to you all. Thank you for being with us. So we just heard the Minister give a policymaker's perspective. Valerie Mocha, I wonder if I can start with you, because our premise at the very start of the day was, you know, what the future of made in Europe looks like. And, you know, given your role in thinking about the sort of pressing problems of our time, are there obvious areas where you think Europe can lead in this, or this is a natural fit for Europe to find the solutions?
Yeah. The absolutely most important question that we need to ask is, who owns the future? I think that is the starting point that will lead us to what kind of digitalization do we want to stand for, or do we want to build in Europe? And who owns the future also means, when we say we hold the future in our hands, who actually can do that? And as a matter of fact, I don't know if you ask yourself, do I own the future? Do you own the future? A lot of people outside don't feel that they own the future outside of this room. So I think the key thing for us, or my wish for what digitalization in Europe could be, is that we stand for people-powered digitalization. And people-powered digitalization is one that is for people, is built with people, and emerges from people. And what that means is that for people is starting with the question, what are the big challenges in Europe that we want to face? And that has nothing to do with digitalization at first. It has to do with the question, how do we ensure that we can age in a good way? What do we do if we have a constantly aging society? What do we do with our environmental challenges? What do we do when it, for example, comes to allowing every kid to have the same educational opportunities? So those are the kinds of challenges that we should tackle with digitalization. And there's a real gap also in the world where we can say we in Europe stand for a continent where we really tackle the big challenges of our time with digitalization. And when it comes to just quickly the other 2 points, with people and from people, that means that with people is we should test new technologies as early as possible with the people who should use it, right? So execution is absolutely the key thing, and we can't just be in our little round tables and little bubbles where everybody who is excited about technology says how great it is, but we need to go out and test it as quickly as possible, and I can talk a bit more about how this is done. And finally, people-powered digitalization from people means that we need to tap into the potential of the 500 million citizens in Europe. And I think at the moment our debate is far too often focused on a few universities and a few businesses and what we as a group can do to shape the future, but we need to acknowledge that there is potential and that there are ideas in every single one of us here in the room, but also in Europe. And the big question is, how do we as a continent really manage to tap into all of this potential? And whenever somebody has a good idea, we can basically invest in that, and we can support that, and we can scale that to solve the big challenges of our time.
Thank you. So Justin, let me turn to you, because on that question, the slide that Joaquin pulled up, who do you trust? Consumer organizations came out rather well in all of that, happily for you. But what do you think the role of an organization like yours is in an age where we as consumers are going to, you know, be connected to many more devices than we ever imagined even 5 years ago.
Yeah, that was very nice to see that. So traditionally, Consumers International, we're basically the membership group for consumer organisations around the world. Traditionally, we use that position to engage in international processes, engage with international organisations like the UN, the G20, to try and influence the guidelines and the principles that were developed. But the issue with that is that these things are high level, and of course, being international, they tend to take time. And as you said yourself in your presentation, people want to see change now. They don't want to see high-level policies, they want to see something happening, projects happening. So increasingly, we're much more interested in, as well as doing the international work, working with marketplace actors, companies, to actually deliver change now. So creating partnerships and using those partnerships to share our understanding and our knowledge to try and develop.
You mean at the design, at the time the product or service is being developed?
Well, I mean, the key example is the Trust by Design guidelines that we've developed with Vodafone. They're not just principles, but they've got guidelines and checklists. So they're really practical. And it's the sort of thing that an SME could pick up and begin to use. You don't have to be an expert in that area. And our hope is that SME suppliers will use these guidelines and these checklists to ensure that consumer priorities, consumer issues are built in from the beginning when they're designing IoT products.
Can you give me an example of something that, you know, perhaps the design or a safeguard was put into it that might not otherwise have been there? Might have developed in a different way had it not been for these guidelines?
And the key issue really is around security and privacy, particularly. Currently, a lot of IoT devices are created with minimal or no security built in. And that can mean that with very little knowledge at all, they're relatively easy to hack, just with a simple smartphone. And one of the issues that's been highlighted a lot is the impact that has if you've got a child's product, like a baby monitor or a child's toy. And there, obviously, the risk is considerable. But the risk is there for any IoT product, whether it's a wearable watch or a fitness tracker or a smart TV. These security issues need to be dealt with because they do pose a real risk for consumers.
Yeah. Well, Nuria, let me turn to you because your role is very much focused on data science, and I imagine a lot of that is use of data. But what is your perspective on the sorts of safeguards that Justin works on and wants to see, you know, incorporated in the manufacturing side?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon. I apologize for my voice. It's usually not like this. So yeah, I completely agree and support what they're doing. Trust has been mentioned many times, and we've seen the graphs on trust. I just wanted to mention a couple concepts around it that could be helpful. First of all, usually trust is contextualized. So I trust you for something. For example, I might trust you to keep an eye on my bag right now, but I'm not sure I would trust you to take care of my kids because I don't know you enough to know. So it's important to understand that usually trust is not in the abstract, but there is usually some context around it. And when we look at trust, usually trust is built based on 3 very important pillars. And if one of the pillars doesn't exist, then trust is broken. The first one is competence. And here we've been talking about execution, so it's related to execution. So competence is having the skills to actually deliver, having the knowledge, the expert knowledge to deliver whatever you are meant to be delivering. The second pillar is reliability, which refers to consistent performance. So not just being competent once, but being competent over time. And the third one is honesty. So those 3 pillars are key. And if we don't fulfill these pillars, then trust is broken. And we are observing this on the side of governments because they haven't delivered with competence, and they haven't been honest in many cases. We see this with technology exactly for the same reasons, because there hasn't been honesty, or the trust that has been placed has been broken because, say, I trust you with my data, but then you haven't been honest about how you deal with my data and so forth. So definitely focusing on how to build trust in the design is key, and in particular for IoT, which was the focus of this, security is definitely a key element, because it would break the competence pillar and it would break the honesty pillar in a sense.
I wonder, is there often a gap between what people say about trust and what, their actions? For example, a lot of us, if asked, might say, well, I don't really trust the use of my data, but the fact is most of us are happy to give it away, 24 hours a day, and we don't really think about it very much. So, I mean, is there such a thing as that gap?
So it is, and this has been documented in the past, not just with digital. There's a very famous study, I think it was done by Harvard, where they were asking people for their social security number in exchange for one candy. So that's how much you value your actual privacy, right? However, when whatever implicit agreement is there, because you consent when you use all these apps, in the terms and conditions, whenever that's broken is when you realize that, oh my God, they have exploited this trusting relationship that we had, and I have been abused, in some way. So it is true that we usually don't make super rational decisions many ways, but implicitly, the expectation is that if it is a trusting relationship, these three pillars should be there. Yeah. And when they are broken is when the damage, is done. Yeah.
Well, let me turn to you, Thibaut, and also just bring us back to the idea of, doing business and designing a business landscape in Europe at this point in time, because your company has had a harder time with its original business model in Europe compared to, for example, in its home market of the United States. Fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
And that has led to a change. I mean, Uber operates in a slightly different way. Actually, in different countries also operates in a slightly different way. But describe the effect of operating in Europe on the business model and the strategy.
Yeah, I think generally in Europe, but also taking a global perspective, what I would say is that there's been a bit of an awakening in technology companies in the past few years, which is echoing a lot of the points which have been made. And I agree with everything that I think you've all said, which is technology companies have a responsibility. We've seen the trust figures. In general, I think consumers and citizens, people are expecting companies that are bringing this technological transformation to take responsibility and to lead the conversation, to propose things. So also to your points, I really agree with that. It's all about action and execution. Talking is good, but you need to show that you're actually doing something about it. So in general, at Uber, I think the shift has been to work with the relevant and credible stakeholders, consumer associations, think tanks, governments, cities, etc., in partnership, and design solutions that plug some of these gaps and address some of these questions and challenges. Specifically in Europe, one place that we've seen was heavily challenged for Uber is really the relationship between technology platforms and work. There's 3 million drivers every day in the world that use the Uber app and platform to work and to make money as a driver, take people around our cities. That's a lot of people. And it's one thing to talk about technology for consumers. There's also specific challenges to what does it mean if you're working using a technology platform and no longer in a more traditional form of employment. And some of the questions we're getting from the media, from our drivers, from our stakeholders, the government was, what are you doing concretely to address some of these challenges, some of these questions around, do you have a way to protect drivers in a way that's fair? And where the gap between employees and workers that are using technology platforms, which are often called gig economy workers, which I don't love, but that's the name. Are you plugging this gap? Are you doing something about it? Are you doing something around skills? Because a driver often will be someone who is joining from a position where they're not able to get a lot of work opportunities in the economy. So what we did about it was, on social protection in Europe, we started a program which we designed in cooperation with large insurance companies, AXA in France, and the government, which protects drivers from accident, from serious illness, disability, and
But
also
they pay for it, right? They pay the premium.
so we, as Uber, pay for that entirely in all of the European countries where we launched it. We have a qualification criteria where we say you need to have done at least 150 trips in the past 8 weeks. So a very low threshold, which means to qualify, you don't need to do a lot on the platform. But we're not asking partners to pay for it. Uber is taking it from its margin.
Once they've done a certain amount of work.
Yeah, which I think in general, it was also a recommendation from the insurance companies and the social security services we work with, which was you need to have a qualification criteria to then get some benefits. So we use their advice. And we started this in France. Now we've scaled it to 21 countries. We added paternity payments, maternity payments. And after a few days of launching it, we had hundreds of dads around Europe saying, I want my paternity payment and I want to take a break because I just had a child. And that's the first thing we did on social protection. The other big thing was on skills. We launched in the UK and France some continuous skills training, which we focused on technology, but also languages, business, accounting. And we're funding some learning programs so that drivers, if they see it as a stepping stone to another step, we're actually helping them get trained through their current occupation.
I wonder, Margareta Schramberg, it would be good to know your perspective on this, because it strikes me that this, and you know, Uber is not the only example of this, but it's quite piecemeal, isn't it? That a company operates in a certain way, a certain European country or city maybe even, or even there's a court case or something happens that challenges their way of working, and then thanks to that it spreads. Do you think there ought to be a more top-down approach to the way that a company like Uber or others operate? Or are you happy to see them develop in this more organic way?
First of all, what we are clearly seeing is that the digital transformation has changed the business models, and that these business models have changed faster than administration was following. If this was good or could have done differently, this is the open question, but this is something for the past. It's just that administration, taxation, for example, protection of people working in the companies has not followed, and is applicable to companies which are not with pure digital business model, but less to companies which have the full digital business model. Looking now at the most valuable companies of the world, this has also changed in the last 10 years or 20 years, which I have been in IT industry. First, we had a lot of companies in the traditional oil industry, you know them all, and now 8 out of 10 are digital companies, a lot of them based in the US. Yeah, so therefore this business model has completely changed. So we also, giving the framework in Europe, we have to change and to adapt to this. And this is what we are talking about when we are talking about the single digital market. So Europe is a very strong market, and we have certain standards and rules. And these have to be followed. And these rules have to be followed, and the taxes have to be paid. Because otherwise you have a different competitive situation. So the small and medium-sized companies and the traditional one are paying the taxes because you can find them, and the virtual business model is out of the rules, out of the game. And this we cannot allow for the future. So we need to find a way together that we regulate this on the European level. We have done something. We have just been heading the European Council. So what we have done is two important things. In the single digital market, we have established, for example, this topic of public sector information, so that digital information, machine to machine, can be a basis for European company to search, so that they do not get a disadvantage. And the other topic is platform to business, where we really want to support the business models, the existing vis-a-vis the platform model. And this does not mean to give a disadvantage to the platforms, but to make it possible to have the same competition. If I'm a small hotel, I should be allowed to offer my services outside the platform and not be bound to the 3 top platforms which are dominating the world market. On the other hand, we have an important issue which has not been tackled now, but in the morning I heard by the chancellor is the topic of industrialization of Europe. Yeah. So digitalization helps to reindustrialize Europe, and we need to do both. We need to protect and help and have our standards applied. It's the European standards, and it's not the Chinese, and it's not the US standards. And this is a valuable topic we have. And second, we need to open up and we need to promote our industries in Europe so that they can be competitive and not be naive about it, that others won't do it.
Yeah. But going back to the question, Valerie, that you asked right at the beginning, that the question is who owns the future? I think many people, arguably, might say, well, it is the Ubers and the Googles and the Amazons who effectively own the future, however else we might want to think about it. Is that, I mean, what would you say to that?
Well, in looking at the business models, so they're all very user-centric and all consumer-centric, but at the same time, looking at the digital companies which are there, they have just grown up. Look at Facebook. Let's take another example. If you look at Facebook and you see the general users of Facebook, they are not below 30. My niece is not using Facebook anymore. She says, how old-fashioned are you using this? So this is changing very quickly, and it's not yet proved that these business models will alone survive. And we always talk about consumer business models. These are all consumer-based companies. B2B is always left out, and Germany and Europe plays a very important role in B2B. Okay. So I think the race is not yet won. We need to take a lot of right actions to make it possible for Europe to succeed more. And the consumer market, they have won. But it's not, as they means the US and China is ahead, but we now need to speed up really rapidly and do things about it.
Okay. Justin, I wonder if I could just ask your perspective on that, on this point about whether, you know, whether the big giant companies have won at least in the consumer sphere.
I think the question of competition does get wound up with the question of trust as well, because very often the response we get when we talk about a lack of trust is, well, consumers are using these services, they continue to use these platforms and search engines and such like. But for many consumers, there isn't actually very much choice out there. If they want to use social media, they want to be on the platform where their friends are as well, then actually there isn't very much choice. And the other impact, of course, is in terms of innovation. Many of the big companies now are snapping up all the small startups if they're looking too promising, and that shuts down innovation for consumers as well. So we want to be in favour of innovation and disruption where it's good for consumers, but there is a danger that a lack of competition will stop innovation as well.
Valerie?
Yeah, so there are tools that government can use to really be in the driver's seat and to ensure that the future doesn't just belong to a few, but that it belongs to many, and that we also support the new winners who come out of Europe, right? And this is all like a very exciting, and I know it doesn't sound exciting, but it is exciting. A new exciting area is what we call anticipatory regulation. So this idea that the regulator and government can actually be the ones who say, we define a certain challenge. I just talked about different social challenges. And then what we use as a tool is so-called sandboxes or test beds, where you basically say, for example, here in Berlin, you could say, how could the future of mobility look like? Or how could we improve our infrastructure so that blood can be transported more quickly between different hospitals? Yeah, 2 examples. And then you say, we know that a lot of European solutions and maybe some potential Uber competitors are struggling in Europe because of very tight regulation. So what the government can do is to say, here's a certain social challenge. We are creating a so-called sandbox, and in that sandbox, different companies and organizations can compete, for example, for money, or can just participate, and they can try their new solutions with the regulatory framework being a bit loosened. So that means that you work with the regulators and then you say, here the normal rules don't apply for a certain amount of time because we want our own innovators to get a chance to try their new products. And the sandboxes we run across the world, often we open them up for about a year, and in that year you can really test out what works, what doesn't, how different technologies can really have benefits or risks, and then the regulator by itself knows what to do and what not to do. So I think it's very important that this innovation in Europe isn't about keeping the US competitors out, but we need to make sure that we execute more, we can experiment more, and we support our own champions, and that works really well, so that, and there's so much interest also from governments that we, for example, created something called a Regulators Pioneer Fund. So that was a fund of just £10 million, and different regulators could apply to that fund to become these pioneers that are really using new tools like sandboxes and testbeds in governments. And if we talk about digitalization made in Europe, it should be that we use these types of tools inside government so that our governments are not the laggards who are always being chased by technology companies, if we are just making it very simple, the fears that we have, but that governments are really in the driver's seat and say, what kind of future do we want to create? What challenge do we want to solve? And innovators, please come and solve those challenges.
Yeah. But I mean, Valerie, to be honest, I mean, how much confidence would you have that governments are in the most agile position to have that sort of view of the future when so often we see an element of playing catch up?
Yes.
Because to do anticipatory regulation, you've got to have a really good idea of the way things are going and what's likely to materialize.
You do need really good people. Because probably you know that this saying that culture eats your digital strategy for breakfast. It is totally true. So many things that are good ideas don't work because in the end, due to politics and kind of, people egos, things don't work out. So I would say there are kind of two things we would need inside governments. Firstly, we need to bring the outsiders in. So I think what happened in Austria is great, that you basically say you bring somebody from the outside in, somebody who doesn't have to queue for 20 years until they get a ministerial position, because that brings in new knowledge and new networks and new skills. And the second thing you need to do is you also need to empower your own civil servants. So if I can I just tell a very quick anecdote, because it is very telling. So we've done various e-government projects across the world, and what we hear a lot from civil servants is that they say, we are often told that we are so slow and so uninnovative and that we are always blocking everything, but the main thing that you contributed is that you just empowered us and acknowledged that we have potential that we can unleash, right? And even some of the most skeptic ones you can excite. So we had that was actually a colleague of mine who had that situation. He was working with a team, and one of the civil servants said, I don't want to do agile stuff. This is not my way of working. I don't want to do this, but I'm just going to do it because I have to. So we did that training, skills training for a couple of days, and afterwards he was asked, so how did you like it? And he said, this is not my way of working. I really don't want to do it, but that was the best working day of my life. So, it's really about acknowledge that there can be superheroes inside government.
Okay. Nuria, I want to turn to you on this question about, what we use, the huge volumes of data that are now available, as long as we have the tools to analyze them properly, and we're willing, indeed, to allow their use. And there was the finding within the Tech Divide survey that showed that, Europeans are less open to use of data than in parts and in some other parts of the world, especially in Asia. As someone who's a specialist in this area, what do you think the parameters should be? Like, where should we be very careful, and where should we absolutely harness this to solve the big challenges of our time?
Well, that's a big question. So I think the first thing is to understand that when we talk about data, or when we talk about AI, we talk about this abstract concept, when in reality is very diverse and is very complex. So there are many different kinds of data, and they have different implications, and they have different complexities and different applications. There is a massive amount of machine-generated data, which is completely different from human-generated data, which most of it is personal data. So when we talk about data, we need to understand, okay, what data are we talking about? Data in itself, I always say, is digital garbage, because if you don't do anything with it, it's useless. And all of us, we have lots of digital garbage on our hard drives because we take thousands of pictures that we probably never look at, right? So the key is how we can make sense of this data. And because of the volume and the complexities, we can only do it using machine learning techniques, which is an area within AI. So that's the relationship between AI and data. So in that context, there are incredibly powerful use cases, many of them for governments, on how we can leverage this data to actually have positive social impact. And Professor Floridi has talked about this, but I have to say, this is an area where I've been working for over 10 years. There's a big movement worldwide, and we are also working on this at Vodafone, how we can leverage the data to help us make better decisions. So I think depending on the use case, the constraints and the implications are very different. Using data to help have better healthcare, to have precision medicine, to solve cancer. Of course, I mean, to address climate change, of course, I mean, we are missing huge opportunities if we don't do it. Using data to manipulate people's opinions before an election, probably not, right? And it's usually it's using the same techniques, right? So I think we also need to contextualize when we say, how using the data, what are we going to use it for, and what are the benefits for society?
And you're right to be really specific on what sort
exactly,
of data
versus
we mean.
the costs.
Yeah.
So again, we cannot have an abstract discussion, but I would say that I do agree with Professor Floridi's talk in the fact that there are massive missed opportunities, a lot of them in governments, because of the lack of probably the right skills and the right ways of working and the right culture to be able to actually leverage the massive amounts of data that we have.
Well, we are nearly out of time, but I want to, given where we are, we will shortly have the European elections, there'll be a new European Parliament, there'll be a new Commission in due course. Given that, I want to ask each of you for what, and I know it's tricky, but really to try and choose one thing as concrete as possible that you would really love the next set of European legislators and policy makers, decision makers at that, at the EU level to seize by the hands and focus on in this next legislative period. Justin, what would you say it should be?
I was hoping I'd be last. I think focus on the emerging issues. Deal with the issues before consumers have to deal with them. So for consumers, the big pressing emerging technologies are IoT and AI. And move away from the idea that any one organization has all the answers. You have to work with others to find solutions to these emerging issues. So focus on emerging issues and work together with others to find solutions.
Valerie?
I would like us to have a big social innovation fund that focuses on 5 big challenges, 5 ways in which the future should look differently, and then funds the best ideas, not the incumbents, but the best ideas that can come from anywhere, and that really maximize, and that the success is measured by how it can impact normal people's daily lives.
Nuria?
So for me, given that I've interacted with politicians in the past couple of years, I would say my biggest learning from this and my biggest wish is that for key strategic societal challenges, we ensure an ambitious plan that is agnostic to whatever political parties are governing at the time.
Yeah.
It's extremely frustrating when there is a political change and all the work of the previous party, is sort of like not implemented or is dismantled, when we are aging the same way, climate is changing the same way, the world is moving exactly in the same way, right? So that would be my wish, that, for key strategic societal challenges, we actually all agree on them and there is a stability, so we actually get to tackle them.
Thibaut?
I'd say it would be for politicians in Europe to truly embrace mobility as a platform as something that can be a massive win in Europe. The European society and economy and cities are actually very advanced in this area, in mobility, in what we do. And I think if done well, the regulatory framework and the way governments and other non-governmental bodies work with companies, and I think more than ever before, a lot of tech companies are open to dialogue and concrete action, can actually create a huge, vibrant European ecosystem. And I think to some of the points that have been mentioned, there has been a feeling often that technology has been a bit of too much of a winner-takes-all sort of landscape. I think that is evolving, especially as now technology is moving into the real world. And mobility is very real. Uber works, for example, with millions of small entrepreneurs, but also businesses, insurance companies, and more in mobility, we work with transit authorities in cities. We launched transit partnerships in Nice, in Paris, in London. We're also working with cities and car manufacturers to have car sharing that could be on the platform. And these are often sectors where European companies lead. So I think if European politicians truly embrace that as, of course, there's a bit of a challenge around tech platforms being so big, but as something that can actually leverage the ecosystem.
Seeing more of the opportunity rather than hearing the word Uber or similar and thinking this is a problem that we need to hit on the head.
And some European companies, I think, can be absolutely successful and win globally on that. Some of the German car makers, the French car makers, the insurance companies establish real estate. There's a big question on real estate in the future of cities. It's shifting massively how we're using real estate for food delivery, for example. A lot of European companies are champions in that. Public transit, one of the world leaders in public transit is a European company, #1 in the US. And they can work with tech platforms, not just Uber, but tech platforms in general, to actually create a pretty big, successful business.
Thank you. And finally, Minister?
And finally, very concretely for the new Commission, it is to concentrate on those topics which will be solved on European level and leave the countries with those topics that they can solve better. So this is called subsidiarity principle. They do what is best for Europe in a total to solve the big issues and not the small issues, not micromanagement, as we see a tendency over the last years, which is leading to too much bureaucracy. And is leading to a world where there is too little room for companies to grow, for individuals to form new companies. So this is one of the big principles. Second, we have created during the European Council a paper, which is a paper for an agreement, reached an agreement among all the countries in the European Union on a new industrial policy for Europe based on digitalization and artificial intelligence. Now, to really implement this, it needs a new competition law and it needs real action to show that we mean it and that European policy is not only consumer protection, but is creating jobs in Europe so that consumers can continue to consume.
Thank you all very much indeed. And I hope they're listening in Brussels and in Strasbourg. Thank you so much. Margrethe Schramburg, Thibaut Simphal, Nuria Oliver, Valerie Mocker, and Justin McMullen. Thank you both. Thank you all, I should say.